If you were a kid in the 90s who played video games on the family computer, you'll undoubtedly remember the prevalence of demos. It was a simple concept. Give potential customers a taste of your game, and it will convince them to purchase the full version afterwards. Way more people are willing to give something new a try if it doesn't cost them anything, so a demo gets your game in front of a much larger potential customer base than if you were just trying to convince them to buy it from the get-go. From the consumer perspective, it's also a win, because they get to try something themselves before deciding if it's worth spending their money on. Just about every piece of software, games or otherwise, offered a demo version, and there were a couple main ways a game could implement it. One way would be to let gamers play a vertical slice of the game, maybe a level or two. It didn't necessarily have to be the beginning of the game either, it could be somewhere right in the middle. The other approach, which was more popular with applications than games, was to offer a timed trial period where the end user had full access to the whole thing for a limited amount of time. As a kid with no disposable income, I and many others like me would primarily play demos and never end up purchasing the game at all. In fact, sometimes your parents would buy a disc with demos on them. I know that sounds crazy, but take this disc for example. 100 great games for Windows 98. I still have this from my childhood, which I would play on the family PC that I actually also still held onto. Luckily, this disc was compatible with Windows 95 as well, which was the operating system my family had installed at the time. I'll admit the name 100 Great Games is a little deceiving because it's actually 100 great demos, not full games on here. But did 6-year-old me care about that? Not even a little, because those demos in the 90s were incredibly feature-rich and endlessly replayable. Allow me to gush with nostalgia for a moment here while I reminisce about some of my favorites from this collection. First up is Jazz Jackrabbit 2. This is a 2D platformer by none other than Cliff Bleszinski. Yes, that Cliff Bleszinski, who would go on to create Gears of War. In it, you would go through various maze-like levels playing as rabbits Jazz and Spaz, both of whom can shoot guns. Rabbits with guns, what more could you want? The environments are beautifully detailed, the animation is bursting with character, and the music is some of the best I've ever heard in a video game. Seriously, 20 years later and I still wake up in the middle of the night with this track stuck in my head. This game is bursting with soul, and even today I would recommend you give it a try for yourself. Next up is Canoodles Mini Golf. I've always been a sucker for mini golf games, and this one may very well have been the starting point for that. This demo supported 2 players and gave you a generous amount of courses to play on with a friend. Whenever my uncle came to visit from Germany, we would play this every day. There are so many gems in here, but I'll finish off this disc mentioning Booga Loopers. It might not look like much on face value, but this is a game so addicting I strongly argue that it totally holds up to this day. I'll give a brief overview here, but I actually am so fascinated by it that I'm planning on making a full video on it eventually. It's entirely controlled via the mouse, and you simply move your cursor around various sci-fi objects to eliminate them from the screen. Once all the items have been cleared, you progress to the next level. If you smash your cursor into too many things, you will explode and need to try again. There are various power-ups that can appear, giving you things like a shield or longer tail, making it easier to loop those boogas. I think it's an interesting choice to have no music during the levels themselves, and in between the levels they play this music where the only lyrics is the word booga over and over again. Tell me this doesn't sound like the soundtrack to a 90s yo-yo competition video. Alright, moving onward. For console gamers in the very early days, demos couldn't really exist. Obviously unable to connect to the internet and using expensive cartridges, the idea of distributing demos made little sense in the 80s. This would become more popular in the 90s though, with the incredibly popular PlayStation console, which used the much cheaper to produce CD-ROM format. Now, retailers and magazines could give out free game demos alongside other products. Of course, there was still no internet connection here like on PCs, so demos were strictly physical affairs for console gamers. It wouldn't be until the 7th generation of consoles when demos would reach peak availability. The PS3, Xbox 360, and Wii all offered internet connectivity and stores that had demos for seemingly everything. During this time, I remember putting hundreds of hours into demos for Burnout Paradise and Skate 2 on my 360. Burnout sectioned off a pretty sizable portion of the map and just let you free roam to your heart's content, and Skate let you do a handful of Hall of Meat maps among some other modes. Another one worth mentioning here is the Ninja Gaiden 2 demo that was so long for a demo that the first time I was playing through it I was almost convinced they had accidentally given me the full game. It's also worth mentioning here that every issue of the Xbox magazine came with a demo disc filled with new demos. They even came in a plastic case that, while not as large as a retail Xbox game, looks much better on the shelf than a paper sleeve that they totally could have used instead. Similarly, on my PS3 there was an endless stream of demos to play. Pretty much all major releases had a demo, and I took full advantage of that. Standout mentions here are the ones for Uncharted and Vanquish. The Wii Shop had a number of demos, but they were mostly smaller indie titles and not the big heavy hitters you might think of when you remember the console. Still, props for having them and all. Nowadays, it seems as though demos have mostly fallen by the wayside. It's rare to see a new AAA game offer any kind of try before you buy service, instead focusing on getting pre-orders and making as many sales before anyone has had the chance to see if it's good or not. Sure, the odd game does have a demo, but they are the exception, not the rule. Recently, PlayStation has completely overhauled its online subscription and have different tiers that offer different levels of service to gamers. The one that stood out to me the most is that if you pay the highest amount, you get access to game trials. Personally, I find this to be pretty strange. I'm glad these demos exist, but to paywall them is kind of defeating the purpose in a way, don't you think? As always, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Are you old enough to remember the good old days of demos? Or maybe you aren't and feel like you've missed out. Please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. It would mean a lot to me. My dream is to hit 1,000 subscribers, and when I do, I'll do a full game room tour you won't want to miss. Until next time, thanks for watching.